So, Lee, how did you get into astrology?
Lust. I mean, what's a better way to get into astrology? I was working on the 1976 New York Regional Lesbian Feminist Conference, which was the first one that had been held in that area. And one of the people who was on the committee invited me to crash at her dorm, because this was back when I was still in graduate school. And one of the people in her dorm I found very attractive, and this woman happened to be into astrology, and at that point I probably would have professed interest in it whether I was or not. But she did the usual thing about saying, okay, and when were you born? And she pulled out Llewellyn, and she pulled out the old Rosicrucian ephemerides, and she picked out a few things and said, okay, well, you're this, you're this, you're this. But I really don't have time. I really don't like calculating birth charts, so I can't really give you your rising sign, but if you really wanted this to be good, you'd have to do that. So I said, so how could I do that? Because I was into science, and doing calculations doesn't bother me. So she gave me this stuff to do it, and of course I did it. And she's turned into a friend over the years, but that was what got me into it originally.
Excellent. What is your particular focus in astrology? You know, we have all these different kinds of astrologers, like evolutionary astrologers and Hindu Vedic astrologers and Hellenistic Greek astrologers. What type of astrologer are you?
Probably the simplest way to classify me is a classical horary and electional specialist.
And what does that entail?
Well, that entails classical, of course. Hard to get a precise definition on the word, but let's say I'm working with the techniques from the Middle Ages up through about 1680. And as for horary, horary is the particular kind of astrology related to asking questions like, should I buy this particular piece of property, or where is my lost watch, or will I marry this particular person? It's all about very specific questions, not general things about the kind of life changes that people go to natal astrologers for. Electional is picking times to do things.
Are there a set of techniques that favor electional and horary more?
Yeah, and actually they're very similar techniques, because in a sense you're turning one on its head to do the other. Horary, you're doing a chart for the time somebody asks you a question. In electional, you're using the same kind of rules that you use in horary to look at a time to do something in the future.
Like get married or whatnot?
Yeah. In fact, that's what's on my desk right now, is I've just been doing an electional chart for a client who is wanting to get married this fall. And she's got a fairly limited time frame to do it in because of having a fiancé visa, which I didn't know our government gave. But so she's got a fiancé visa, and her fiancé is getting out of the military then.
Nice. How has astrology impacted your life, both personally and as a career?
Well, you're not asking the small questions, Kelly, are you? Well, since it is my career, it obviously impacted my life massively, because at the time I found it, I was working my PhD in botany. So, I mean, perish the thought I might be out there doing plants right now if it weren't for astrology. So it's impacted my life tremendously, because I got into it enough to be doing it full time, and especially now through Kepler College. I mean, it's in this household we live, sleep, and breathe astrology, so it's impacted everything.
In terms of botany and your passion for plants, I noticed in the Essential Dignities you had a lot about early classifications of plants. Can you talk about that for astrologers?
Yeah. And I think it's a really important area that's largely neglected, is that if you're using astrology for really trying to create a healthy lifestyle for yourself, and maximizing, this isn't about so much curing disease, it's about what kind of life really is something that you're most comfortable with, that's least stressful to you. One of the ways to work with that, ultimately you get into the tradition of medical astrology, which is a very rich field. Most of the astrology that was being done in the Middle Ages was either justified or taught through medicine, and so it's a big area. The plants and of course herbs are a big piece of how people adjusted one your relationship to the environment, because most of what affects us from a medical standpoint and stress is stuff we can't control. If it's winter, it's going to be cold, unless you're in Florida. But yes, you can move to Florida, but if you're in a particular area, the kinds of things that you can adjust include your diet, which is largely plants, even for people who aren't vegetarians. It's the plants where you can make the adjustments in terms of what kind of qualities are coming into your life. So it's a big area, and one that has been, I think, sadly neglected in this century.
In astrology, there's a whole field of medical astrology.
That's right.
Can you talk about that? I noticed in one of your books you were talking about the ancient medical model and its influence on people's psyches. I mean, can you talk about that a little bit?
Yeah, sure. One of the things that's important for us to remember, we've been enmeshed in what we call allopathic medicine in the West here for well over a century. The ancient, or the classical, whichever word you want to use, conception of medicine is so much broader than we think of now, because when we think of medicine, we think, I'm sick. I have this disease, I have this symptom, I have to cure this disease or symptom. That's not how anybody in any traditional society in the world ever viewed it. Disease was simply, in certain respects, an outgrowth of what was going on with you in terms of your health. Now, granted, if you had an accident or you had an injury or something, that's a different story. But basically, most societies have looked at the fact that we have natural tendencies, and that as long as things are working within that realm and you don't abuse it, then you're basically healthy. It's when things get out of whack that then you can become diseased, as the term was. Now, until about 1850, the medical astrology specifically related to the old ideas of medicine in general, and that was the Hippocratic model and Galen's synthesis of it. So it was the traditional medicine. That started to break down as a scientific view in the 19th century, because basically at that point, the doctors themselves were moving away from that traditional model to what eventually became allopathic medicine. So until that point, the astrology was simply integrated into the whole thing. From that point forward, one of the things that became very popular was homeopathy. This is among astrologers. And in fact, most of the people from about 1880 through, let's say, about 1920, 1930, who were doing medical astrology were homeopaths. So there's a big relationship there. And it's not hard to see, because the homeopathic remedies are all things that have pretty much traditional astrological rulerships. So it's an area that's very easy to get into. More recently, I think one of the issues has really become that many of the people who've tried to come up with more modern approaches to astrological medicine have kind of been up against this change in what is medicine. Because somebody in let's say, Nicholas Culpeper's time in the 17th century wasn't focused in on disease as a complex like lupus or like cancer. He was interested in fever, or he was interested in excess phlegm. In other words, they looked at symptoms, and they looked at herbs or other techniques to work with symptoms. They didn't look at complexes the way we do now. The other thing is that there's a lot of focus today, again through our own societal medical model, on the big diseases, cancer and heart attacks and stuff like that. And what ends up happening is we all get deluged with all this wonderful do-it-yourself medicine, and well, if there's cancer in your family, then you need to go for frequent checks, and maybe you need to do these sorts of things. And if there's heart disease in your family, then you need to eat this, or you don't need to eat that. And if there's diabetes in your family, then you need to do this. So a lot of the medical stuff that's basically been attempted in the last 20 years has been trying to address these same issues of taking the birth chart and say, based on the birth chart, can I in fact predict what major diseases this person will develop later in life? Now, this is not a question that was ever really asked prior to about the last 20 or 30 years. And I think that we have to at least acknowledge that a lot of what's been done in the last 20 or 30 years, while very interesting, is still probably should be considered preliminary.
Yeah, I've seen some books on astrology and flower essences, and relating Neptune to one of these essences or what. I mean, the ancients could have known about Neptune.
No, and Neptune. Surprise! Neptune's a hard one to get your hands on, isn't it, Kelly? I think the thing about Neptune is that one of the areas where a lot of the 20th century astrologers have tried to go with Neptune, and I think quite rightly, is in looking at the relationship between Neptune and the immune system. But the more that biologists and biochemists and everybody have been studying the immune system, the vaster it becomes, and the more it leaks into other areas. And one of the things that can be very tricky, and there's a long history of this in astrology that maybe we'll get to later, of astrologers wrapping themselves around the science of the moment, whatever is appearing in nature this week. And when you get too wrapped in that and you get too on top of that particular thing, when the science moves on, then the astrologers kind of get hung out to dry a little bit there. Because it's just a thing that you have to realize when you're trying to make correlations like that. If you're correlating with a field of knowledge that fully admits to itself that is constantly changing and constantly evolving and constantly progressing, then there are going to be problems if you expect that your eternal art is going to glom onto the version of it that is in the moment. It doesn't work.
To the uninitiated person who knows nothing of astrology and has just found horoscopes and has just gone beyond that to like, wow, I found my chart on the internet. What does it mean? How would you define astrology?
Well, different societies, of course, have defined it differently, but I would define astrology as a system of correlations that the simple way to put it historically is the macrocosm, microcosm idea, that there's something about being able to look at movement outside of you. In this case, it's the movement of the planets, and that kind of movement correlates to a similar movement in yourself or in society. You notice I'm saying absolutely nothing about causation here, because I don't think you need any form of causation. So we're simply saying there seems to be some correlation.
Yeah, I mean, the scientists attack us because, they say, oh, the sun has a little bit of electromagnetism, magnetism, and that could affect us a little bit, we wake up to it, and the moon maybe through gravity with the tides, but in terms of the strong and weak nuclear forces and what they know as the forces of the universe, and in terms of the manifest physical universe, they try to put down astrology. What do you say to the skeptics who say, there's only these four forces, these physical forces, and there's, they don't recognize, say, maybe that consciousness is a force?
Well, the first thing I say is that most of the skeptics who are talking about this are not, in fact, scientists. They're draping themselves in scientific clothing, but they're not. If you look at the history of PSYCOP, the Committee for the Scientific Investigation of Claims of the Paranormal, which was the big skeptical organization in the United States, it's primarily composed of non-scientists, to the extent that their original organizing manual had a section on how to attract scientists, just like it had a section on how to attract women. So, I mean, these are groups that actually, if you look at the development of the skeptical movement, they have a huge relationship in terms of overlap of original membership to people who, for example, were radical atheists. Well, personally, I have nothing against atheists, but the point here is that if you understand that one of the components of atheism is that it's hard as an atheist to come up with a system where you can imagine that something like astrology can work. So if that's your belief system, and then you say, well, there's nothing to astrology, are you expressing facts or are you expressing your belief? And so the first thing I do when challenged by skeptics is say, what are your credentials? I've got a PhD in botany. So show me your degrees. So that's one thing, that there's been a lot of people claiming to expertise that they don't actually have. So that's one thing. The second thing is, having done astrology, when I got interested in astrology, it was in the 70s. I was in grad school, as I said. I was in grad school in botany at Rutgers University. Not a bad place. Everybody in my department knew I was doing astrology. I read tarot cards for graduate students and professors. So everybody knew I was doing it. It didn't affect my graduate career one bit, because frankly, most scientists don't care. So where is this interest in going against astrology? Well, you find more of it in physics departments and in astronomy departments. But again, even there, I think a lot of this is that it's the politically correct position. And
like the 186 scientists.
Yeah,
objections against astrology.
Yeah, and the thing is that even Carl Sagan, who himself was very much anti-astrology, said this is ludicrous, because here are people objecting to the belief in astrology, where what they're putting down is their belief in non-astrology. So it doesn't make any sense logically. And again, it was a publicity stunt. Let's be honest.
What is your favorite, quote, aspect of astrology? I mean, what fascinates you about astrology?
Well, it's a never-ending field. I mean, that's the thing. I started this well over 30 years ago, and I'm still not bored. So perhaps the most fascinating thing about this is that you could spend a lifetime at it and just scratch the surface.
And what is one of your favorite techniques that you like to use?
Well, I'm a classicist, so that means that the style that I do to get into the technical side is very much caught up with things like essential dignities, which is something that has been largely lost in modern astrology. And since I'm a horror astrology, I'm kind of into those kind of techniques. So I'm one of those rules people. But I'm also a somewhat odd rule person, because I'm the rule person who ultimately is an anarchist.
Could you speak to us a little of, in the Kaluga Brown sense, speak to us of essential dignities? Can you tell us about Ptolemy and his astrological contribution?
Well, it's on the one hand, it's hard to overestimate the effect of Ptolemy, but not because he was so much of an innovator. Ptolemy was so important because he was a compiler, and then his compilations just stuck. It's like he became the bestseller. Nicholas Culpeper with the herbal didn't become famous because he invented it. It was because actually the whole thing that's Culpeper's herbal basically was the old London pharmaceutical dispensary, but he translated it out of Latin into English. So, the same thing with Ptolemy. He wasn't so much inventing the techniques as compiling them. What I think was appealing, and why Ptolemy ended up becoming the bestseller that it did, is that Ptolemy lived in a period where the science of the day, and this is science used loosely, was really beginning to grapple with the Aristotelian model of reality, let's say. And so Ptolemy's astrology wasn't so much that of the practitioner. He wasn't the astrologer out there in the field. He was the intellectual. And being the intellectual, he was trying to fit the astrology that he knew into a greater philosophical and intellectual context. When you consider that astrology really flourished in Europe from what's called the 12th century Renaissance forward, and that was through the schoolmen, as they were called, the people who formed the universities and then ran the universities. All these people were into Aristotle. And so here was Ptolemy starting to sound like an Aristotelian. And so they ate it up with a spoon. So I think that's a lot of the popularity, whereas somebody like Vetus Valens, whose work is much more pragmatic. I mean, he's got horrors about baby lions and things like that, and for us, reading this stuff is just a panic. And a modern astrologer, even if you don't do the Hellenistic techniques, you can look at something like Valens and totally relate to the guy. But that's not what became the bestseller. And it's how does the written word transmit from generation to generation? When it goes through philosophers, they're going to like the guy who sounded more philosophical.
Yeah, can you talk about where astrology came from, what its source was, and what cultures did have an influence on it, like the Arabs? Or
Well, I think the thing is, pretty much every culture has had an astrology. And it's what's very obvious is the sky. The sky is out there. And every culture, it's the idea of being able to see these wonderful motions in the sky at night. It's awesome. The idea of being able to see the moon and the changes in the moon as a timing phenomenon is awesome. The idea of realizing that there's this solar cycle of the year that is so important from an agricultural standpoint. I mean, these are all things that humans have looked at and wondered for millennia. So who starts it? Everybody starts it, because it's there. It's this concept of time is just so overpowering. As far as Western astrology is concerned, the Babylonians probably get the lion's share of the credit, because they developed the system of the constellations that is recognizable today. They came up with the basic signs of the zodiac and a lot actually about the interpretations of them. They started being able to follow the motions of the planets. They did observations over centuries. They compiled methods ultimately of being able to compute the positions, not as accurately as we can today, but with reasonable accuracy. They were able to develop to the point where they could predict eclipses. Now, anybody who's been in an eclipse has seen a real eclipse. This is an awesome phenomenon, and it's a scary phenomenon if you're not expecting it. So the idea of predicting this was just wild. The Babylonians came up with a system of omens, of which the celestial omens were only a part. A big part later on, and in a sense it transmitted more than some of the other stuff. But the Babylonian idea of divinity was, basically, humans are slaves. The gods are out there, they're the big cheese. And so the king was basically seen as being like the overseer of the slaves. So if the king's going to be able to do his job, he's got to know what his bosses are telling him. And so the way that society believed about this is that anything that occurs out of the ordinary is potentially a sign from the gods that, hey, straighten up and fly right. And so what developed over the centuries was a correlation system, really, that, as we would call them, the priests, to be kind of generic, noted that there would be an unusual birth. And then they would look for what that was the sign of, and then these things would be recorded. There's a scholar by the name of Rochberg, who's written a book, it's up there somewhere, called The Heavenly Writing. And she had talked about the fact that one of the forms of birth that they correlated with was the birth of human babies who had more than one head. Now we're all going, okay. It's rare, but it's not unknown. And so they had compiled this whole series of omens based on where the second head was. And at first, every time I looked at this stuff until her book was released, I just kind of glazed and went, oh, please. And then I was reading through the section when her book was published, and it just so happened to be at the time of one of the treaties that was going on between Egypt and Israel. And it was right around the time, in fact, the BBC webpage was doing a little piece on the birth of this girl in Egypt who had two heads. And they showed pictures. I thought, oh, gotta at least look, right? So I went into the material to find what the position of the head in the place it was on this two-headed baby was in the Babylonian system. And it described a situation of the prince for your enemy giving territory. And you see, this is precisely what was going on in the news at the same time that they're doing this whole thing about getting the doctors in the operation to remove the second head. And I'm thinking, oh my goodness, here is this millennia-old idea of the correlation of the second head with this meaning, and that's exactly what was going on in the news at the same time. So it's wild stuff. But so that's part of the system. Is the Babylonians were basically looking at the sky not to tell me, a mere peon, what my life was going to be like, but to talk to the overseer, which was the king, and ultimately to the country and say collectively, because in the Babylonian system of divinity, my life as an individual was really quite trivial. So why would the gods bother to really give me a message? But giving the country a message, giving the king a message, that's a different matter.
Yeah, you said in Essential Dignities that the Babylonians astrologers could have cared less whether the king was a nurturing type. They wanted to know what would happen to a military campaign if launched this year.
Yeah.
So for them, astrology was very much about trying to predict the future, but modern astrology is completely different. Can you talk about the differences?
Yeah, and let me also jump over and just say you've got the same thing in China. I think many, now with some of these excavations that are going on in mainland China, in some of the tombs, and many people have heard of the fact that they were doing, they were using the turtle shells to do divination. Basically, it was the same idea. And when it comes to divination, which is where the omens really live, it doesn't matter whether you're doing the sky or whether you're doing turtle shells or sheep bones or whatever, really. But what was always happening was, in China, with every lunation and with every change in the quarters, meaning spring, summer, fall, winter, it was the king's job, because the king was the prime diviner, the emperor of China. It was his responsibility to ask the heavens, which is to say the gods, what do I need to do the right thing for this period of time? And the way to get the answer to that was, in this particular case, there were, ultimately there were celestial omens too, but you put the hot poker in the turtle shell and see what happens. So all of these are basically systems for understanding how we collectively, not we individually, are supposed to be operating, and what are the signs for this particular time.
Could you talk about how modern astrology has a sort of a more of a, you're sort of fated, but you have sort of a free will within the array of possibilities to kind of create your own destiny. I mean, it seems like we've come a long way from being little slaves.
Well, free will's been an issue that people have been grappling with for millennia, and it's a tough one. And part of the tough one is that when you do something, did you do it because you wanted to, or did you do it because you had to? Because, frankly, it wouldn't look any different to us. And that's the real kicker, If whenever it was fated, if you just got this big purple splotch in your vision field so that you could know that you were stuck with it, it would be a lot easier. But the fact is, we can't tell the difference. The Greeks actually had a very elaborate system for talking about the degrees of fate and free will. So as I say, it's not a new idea. What is new in the modern world, and modern astrology essentially comes out of the 19th century. What happened in the 19th century, and there's a very good book by Patrick Curry about this, called The Edwardian Prophet. And what happened in this period of time was that England, like many of the countries around, had fortune-telling laws. And astrology fell under the fortune-telling laws. So there was this guy, Alan Leo, that many modern astrologers might recognize, who was basically one of the people to figure out how to do a horoscope business. And you go into modern astrology, you go into any of the books now, or the magazines now, that tell horoscopes, and it's send away for your chart, $5, right? Well, Leo is really one of the progenitors of this, because what he figured out was that he should put together a pile of the paper that describes Sun in Leo, and the paper that describes Sun in Cancer, and the paper that describes the Moon in Capricorn and the Moon in Sagittarius. And so we'd have somebody there who'd do a quick, pull out the ephemeris, do a quick chart for the person, and then pull out the pages corresponding to each of the planets, and that was your horoscope. So, a little primitive, but really not terribly different than what's been done for a while since then. Well, he kept getting arrested. And so, he got off on technicalities like they arrested him for something done by his organization at a point where he was out of the country. Okay, well, that's a technicality, you get out of that. So finally, after a few times of this happening, Leo basically says to his lawyer, well, enough of this. How do I stop getting arrested? And the guy cleverly says, well, don't predict. So at this point in time, Leo turns around and he re-releases this material and takes the position. Astrology is not about prediction. Astrology is character delineation. And this is right during the time where Freud is starting to become known, and the other people, because psychology itself as a separate academic discipline didn't originate until the 19th century. So psychology is just coming up. And here's Leo who's saying, well, we're just doing the same thing they're doing. We're doing character delineation. And so he basically changed it to stay out of jail. Then the joke is they arrested him one more time for fortune telling and got him. So it's like, this is the karma. He modifies the whole thing, and then the universe says, we're arresting you anyway. So that really was, I think, the origin of it. I'm not saying there isn't psychological astrology. I think it's a really, really intriguing relationship to work with. But I don't think it ever was, I would think that an astrology that's only based on psychology is much poorer than it needs to be.
Yeah, I think Stephen Forrest said once that God holds half the cards, we hold the other. He goes, and I'm still wondering really how many we really hold.
Well, if you just knew what those cards were when you're holding them, wouldn't it be so much easier?
Yeah. It seems almost, it seems funny that a guy named Leo would invent sun sign astrology.
Well, it wasn't called sun sign astrology yet, and it wasn't, he was doing the whole chart. Sun sign astrology, there are a couple ideas about who to either credit or blame, depending on your point of view. But let's say sun sign astrology originated somewhere in the 1920s or 1930s, and it was a ploy to sell newspapers and so forth. Hey, it worked.
Still working?
Yep, still working.
In the beginning of Essential Deities, you said when astrology went indoors, something was lost. It became possible to conduct astrology in a way that's counter to the way the sky looks.
Mm-hmm.
And talk about what gets lost when we stop looking at the sky.
One of the things that gets lost, and I think it's very important for astrology students to actually go out and look at the sky. I can't say that enough, because it's really important, because otherwise you read things and it's like, among the techniques that just everybody gets all incensed about is orb size. I mean, how many arguments have you heard over the years about what size orb to use? Well, you go out and look at the sky, and look in the ephemera, see how far apart the bodies are that are being called conjunct, and go out and look and say, do I think that those bodies are in the same place? Actually seeing the phenomenon really changes your orientation toward it. Something like declination, which a lot of people just kind of go, ooh, one of those advanced techniques, let's see, is that longitude or latitude or right ascension, and everybody just kind of scratches their head a little bit. But the fact is that when you live in a place in the temperate zone, as so many of us do, and you become aware of things like, where does the sun rise in different seasons of the year? I mean, now that people are getting into things like green building and being concerned about things like not spending more money on air conditioning, a lot of that is about siting a house to take advantage of declination changes so that you're taking advantage of the sun in the winter and not taking advantage of the sun so much in the summer. That's declination.
I've seen astrologers use it, would say, like, progress moon. As its declination rises, you're supposedly going to rise and then fall. Is there a sort of cycle along that? Or
I don't do so much with progressions, and I'm not saying that they don't work. It's just not where I put my energy. So ask somebody who's a little more knowledgeable about it.
Oh, by the way, for our wedding, we got a telescope. A big
Cool.
one. 5 people went in and bought us a big one.
Oh, cool.
So I took my kid out and we were looking at a star, and you could actually see the textures on the star, and you could see little moons around Jupiter, you know. So.
Cool.
And I agree with you that. I mean, my teacher when I was 14 had a 6-inch telescope, and on Saturdays in between astrology classes and home cooked bread, we'd go out at night and look and when I saw Saturn and the moons around it, I was just like, it was breathtaking.
Yeah, it's a religious experience.
It is.
It still is.
Can you describe the ancient system of qualities and humors within a reasonable time frame?
I'll try. Yeah, basically, and this goes back to the Hippocratic model. The Hippocratic model was there 4 basic qualities. They're called hot, cold, wet, and dry, and those actually do have something to do with how they work. The hot is simply high energy. Cold is low energy. And so, you go out, you start exercising, and you sweat. Well, you're hot. Now, the sweat part is wet. but, it's hot and cold. And when people talk about the Latin temperament, that's the hot temperament. When they talk about the Scandinavian temperament, that's the cold temperament. So, hot and cold is pretty easy to see. Wet and dry's been a little harder for people to get in contact with, because to us, the difference between something being solid and being liquid is so basic that it's like, how do you blend in? Well, the difference is basically how granular is something. So one way to think of this is that sand is wetter than a boulder. Okay, because it's a surface area thing. And another way to think of this is that wet is when, and think of people with a lot of water in their chart perhaps. When you're looking at something from a wet point of view, you're seeing connections. When you're looking at things from a dry point of view, you're looking for distinctions. Now, the idea is, all of us have all 4 of these qualities. It's rare to have any one of those completely absent. But having them dominant, that's relatively common. But we all have them. And so our particular balance is called our temperament. And so that's a basic starting point. And then where it gets interesting is, there are all these things that interfere. So, aging interferes. Your basic overall health can interfere. The season of the year can interfere. Your diet can interfere. Your exercise patterns can interfere. Stress can interfere. So there are all these things. It's like you have this body that's walking around wanting to be this particular way, but you're constantly being bombarded by life. And these bits of life that are coming at you in seemingly a random pattern, although as astrologers we don't believe that for a minute, are things that you have to adapt to. You get this bolt of Saturn energy, which tends to be cold and dry. Although, being in a particular sign, it may not be so much. But, suddenly you get this blast of Saturn in your life. You have to adapt to it. And so in the process of adapting, either you adapt, or basically you get sick. And in a sense, you can look at disease coming out of this humoral system, which is not necessarily the only way you can become diseased, but it's one way. That kind of disease is, I've been zapped by this energy that I can't cope with. And so I haven't found a way to move gracefully in this matrix.
Well. Yeah, take a drink.
Yeah.
Oh. I like it. Astrologers have a lot to learn from the ancients. Could you talk about the massive sort of intercourse that was happening between Hellenistic Greece and India during the times when Alexander was on the march?
Well, Alexander was only the tip of the iceberg. Now, a couple things. First of all, when you start talking about this, you're treading on some serious political ground. And we have to acknowledge that. But all of the societies from Europe into Asia were porous, to a degree. And they were porous basically because people always wanted to make a buck. I mean, let's be honest. They weren't bucks then, but, whether you call it trade, but wealth, basically. Transportable wealth. And so they're merchants. And the fact is that there have been commodities that have been present in one place that haven't been present in another. Whether it's a particular kind of stone, whether it's a kind of weaving, whether it's a kind of pottery, whether it's a gem, whether it's gold. Substances tend to not be all distributed evenly. And so people trade. And the thing about people when they trade is they also talk. And this really, I think, is the genesis of what I'm saying about societies not being being completely demarcated and being porous. What was happening is, for many years, the Greeks basically built up their wealth by trading, and then ultimately by war. But that's another story. But when the Greeks did trading, they didn't just take a ship someplace or take a caravan someplace and pick up what they were interested in and leave. What the Greeks got into was actually having settlements in the places where they were trading. And so, yeah, Alexander went over there to India, got that far, and then faced a semi-mutiny and said, okay, we're going back. If it had just been that, there would have been much less of an effect. But there were Greek trading communities, and in fact, some of the early Buddhist art is specifically attributed to Greek aesthetic styles. The versions of Buddha which are kind of look in the same kind of aesthetic mode as some of the Greek stuff, with the thinner Buddhas, not the fat Buddhas, but the ones that really have a physique. So
the less compassionate ones.
Yeah. Well, and yeah, definitely not the laughing Buddhists. But the thing is that what would happen is these Greeks would be living over there. I mean, they'd have multiple generations of people living in these areas. They'd speak Greek. They speak whatever the native language is, and the people there, because they knew they were there for the long haul, so they'd be looking at the Greek gods. They'd be looking at the indigenous gods, and they'd say, "Oh, this one kind of looks like that one," and so they'd get into these kind of hybrid situations. Well, this is the kind of environment in which, somebody comes over, is interested in astrology. What are you going to talk about? Hey, what do we talk about? We go every place, we talk about astrology. So you talk to the people there that were into astrology. And so ideas tend to move around in that soup. There does seem to have been a lot of transmission of ideas. But we don't know the dimensions of it. And I still have a little bit of lingering doubt about some of the scholarly work at this point, specifically because of one question that I have, which is that we've had at least several different kind of generational points of view in the history of science as an academic field relative to astrology, and around the turn of the century, from the 1900s to the 19th century to the 20th, if you were going to mention astrology at all, you had to make all sorts of scathing references to it as being reprehensible. Well, these idiots who were believing in it, couldn't believe that anybody serious was into it. So you went through that thing. That was George Sarton's generation. Then you get this guy, Lynn Thorndike, and that little set over there is Lynn Thorndike's History of Magic and Experimental Science, which is one of the real groundbreaking series in the history of science on astrology. Lynn Thorndike did this whole extensive set where he went from the first 13 centuries of AD, as we say, up through the 17th century. And he talked about all these things, and basically Thorndike said, hey, there's astrology all over the place. Now, he wasn't a believer, but he didn't feel like he had to waste his time making all these politically correct statements about how terrible it was. He just did, he just said, okay, well, it's in alchemy, it's in medicine, and so he basically was showing how astrology related to all sorts of intellectual endeavors. And then there were still people around who were basically trying to say, well, it's nice and defined and only in these particular areas. And over time, there's been more acceptance of how ubiquitous it became, but still, there's some points of view that kind of interfere with how people view issues. Now, one of the big historians of science who just died a couple of years ago was David Pingree. Huge guy in this history, did a ton of work on Vedic astrology, the history of Vedic astrology, some of the Hellenistic stuff, a lot of the Arabic stuff. Had a large department at Brown University where he trained a lot of graduate students and now people who are out there being head honchos of their own departments. But the thing was, Pingree, again was at this school where he didn't have to say a whole lot negative about it, but this was definitely not his thing. So in one of his works, he made a comment about how actually transmission is a very interesting thing, because since astrology is so very wrong, okay, it takes a minute, so stay with me. Since astrology is so bogus, if you see two cultures doing the same technique, because it's so bogus, it could not possibly have originated in both places. It had to be transmitted from one to the other. Okay, now, that's a point of view. And what that means is that and when you understand that Pingree honestly believed this. He believed that if there was any real, now, not something like maybe signs, but division by 12, it's like, unless you can come up with a kind of a physical, gross explanation, like, okay, well, maybe the 12 are months and there is some correlation there with the solar year. But anything in astrology that was a little more theoretical, a little more derivative, if two cultures were both doing it, Pingree absolutely believed that one had to transmit it to the other. Now, this has kind of fallen smack down into this political issue of Hellenistic astrology and Vedic astrology. There is no question that there are a lot of, let's say, analogous things in the two of them. There's no question that you can look at Sanskrit and see certain derivations of some of the names of the planets that look like Greek. So there's some intriguing things. But you also have to understand that the people who really got into this argument had a point of view that basically required the idea, if you had two elaborate systems of astrology that had similar components, they couldn't possibly be right. So there had to be transmission.
I guess they've never heard of Leibniz and Newton, huh?
Well,
both independently developed calculus.
Yeah, well, that's, to me, that's pretty mysterious too. But yeah, sometimes you have to grapple with the arguments about that. I mean, there's one of the things that has been a bugaboo in the last couple of years is a question, and this is something that Pingree really started, was an issue in history about the origins of horary astrology and electional astrology. And Pingree had taken the point of view that electional astrology had originated in the Hellenistic zone, was then transmitted to India, and then mutated in India to become horary, what they would call prashna. And then that was retransmitted to the West, where it became horary. Now, I'm not going to speak to whether this hypothesis is true or not, because that's not my area of expertise, and as a practitioner I could care less, actually. But I mean, as someone interested in the history of astrology, I'm interested in the topic. But the thing to me is that as a practitioner, what I would look at is that the whole structure of Babylonian omens, the whole structure of the way the Chinese did omens, this kind of questioning process to me is so much the same intellectual process as horary, that to ask a question whether you're doing celestial stuff or birds or sheep entrails, to me almost doesn't matter. That you don't have to wait as long as either this Hellenistic or Vedic period to see people asking questions in what we would now recognize as a horary way. But you see, that's the argument of a practitioner. It's not a historical argument. I can't prove that what I'm seeing as the way that a Babylonian would think is relevant to the history of Hellenistic astrology or Vedic astrology. So you've got issues in there that the way that a practitioner might view these questions is significantly different than a historian, especially a historian who doesn't accept the practice itself and therefore is, limited to thinking that complex systems can only be transmitted.
I've been looking into profections lately, and I noticed
it's an interesting system.
I noticed I'm 36 this year, so I'm kind of back to my ascendant, and then transiting Jupiter happens to is going by, which is interesting. Could you talk about the technique of profections?
Well, I think it's a very interesting one because certainly profections come out of the Hellenistic system, but it's funny you should mention Jupiter. Now, of course, in the Hellenistic period, the idea of sign and house, and you still see this. Shall we pause a minute for that to go over?
Yeah, back to perfections in Jupiter.
Yeah. You still see this idea when people talk about essential dignities, and sometimes when you're talking about, say, Mars and Aries, you'll say Mars is in the house of Aries, and this is coming to the whole sign idea of the Greeks, where where house and sign really were the same thing, because if the first house had Aries rising, well, then the first house was Aries. But the thing is also, the Jupiter cycle is something that clearly has been interesting to many societies. I don't think there's any question that the idea of coming up with a 12-based zodiac, the 12-house system, the 12-sign system, ultimately has some relationship to the lunar cycle. I mean, that's the 12 and a half months in a solar year is a very compelling idea to us as an astronomical thing. But societies have recognized the Jupiter cycle for years. In fact, the Chinese were so intrigued by Jupiter that they actually invented a counter-Jupiter. And this counter-Jupiter had a precisely 12 solar year cycle. And that was the thing that they went through. They went through practically certainly every new dynasty, and oftentimes new emperors, came up with a new calendar. And they were always trying to get the calendar that made Jupiter the most perfect. So is there a correlation with the Jupiter? Well, is it just a coincidence?
Yeah. What is a profection for someone that doesn't know?
What a profection is the idea that when you're born, of course, there are 12 houses to your chart. And that one way of looking at the movement of time would be to move one house per year. Now, you can interpret house as being sign. And then depending on whether you want to do whole sign or whether you want to do it in our modern house systems, one way or the other, what you're basically doing is moving a house a year. So, and the tricky part, the trick question is that in your first year, you are actually 0 years old. And so you have to play the game of first year is first house, second year is second house, but second year means you're 1 year old. So, you got to get through that one, but then the whole system works.
What is your involvement with Kepler College, and how's it going?
And
what is Kepler College?
Well, Kepler College is the only institution in the Western Hemisphere that is authorized to grant bachelor's degrees, associate degrees, and master's degrees in the study of astrology. Now, there are some degree programs at other places where you can do the history of astrology, but we're a little more comprehensive than that. So that's what Kepler is. We are in, as we're talking right now, we're into our 8th year, and so of the bachelor's program. The MA and the AA programs are a little newer. I'm academic dean, so that's my involvement. I've been teaching at Kepler since the first year. And it's the most awesome thing I've ever done in my life.
What would the curriculum be like for an aspiring astrology student who wanted to go there? Like over the 4 years, like maybe?
Yeah. It probably makes more sense to talk about the BA program. The first year of Kepler is a year of history, and it's also when you get into writing term papers. I mean, this is not baby college, this is real college. So what we take people through in the first year is the history of astrology, starting in prehistory and going up to the modern era. And in the process, you also learn about world history at this time. because a lot of how we frame it is in terms of intellectual movements that are going on at the same time that astrology is developing, because largely that's how things worked. Astrology wasn't really isolated for most of history and in most times. So you study history, you write term papers, you do debates, and generally you get you accommodate yourself to the college life. Now, we're an online school except for a symposium that lasts over a long weekend, once every term, and we have 3 terms per year, plus summer, which is optional. And so that's for year 1. Year 2, we take up what we call the core curriculum. And in that period, for people who've never studied astrology before, you get the rudiments of the practice from point 0. If you have studied astrology before, then you find out about the people that you didn't study. And during that year, you'll do modern astrology, Hellenistic astrology, Vedic astrology, and get yourself through to the point where you can calculate a chart by hand, because we have people do that, and take people through so that they know the vocabulary and they know the working pieces. Now, all this we try to do from a cross-cultural perspective, and also from a critical perspective, which means that we present different schools and different points of view. Starting in the junior year, people declare their majors and their minors, and so at that point you start to study things from kind of a different point of view. For example, in our East-West major, there's a lot of comparison. For example, I teach 3 courses that are cross-cultural comparisons. In one, we compare horary and electional and medical. And so in the medical course, which in fact I just completed teaching this a couple weeks ago with Gary Gomes, what we taught the students was basically the entire Western classical style of medical astrology, and he taught the Vedic system. And so we're not just we are teaching them as separate systems, because what we absolutely do not advocate is taking 1 from column A and 2 from column B. But we teach them separately, but we ask questions like, what are the 2 systems looking at the same thing? And so you're basically using this also as kind of a mirroring process to examine how people view disease, how people view health, how people view medical questions astrologically. So we just have started a minor in astrology and human behavior, so there's going to be material in there about developmental models, for example. We have some depth psychology that is being taught there, Jungian psychology that is taught in that. So at the upper division level, you're really examining these ideas from different points of view, often multiple cultural perspective, often multiple historical perspective, but in greater depth. People do some literature, because we also do the astrology through literature. We inflict statistics on everybody, so that, and this is part of, we have a general history of science module where we ask some questions about how do skeptics view astrology? Is this right? Is this wrong? And not so much from the standpoint of right or wrong as from the standpoint of what is the logical process going on here. And how can we understand it through the logical process, and how can we use that process ourselves? So we've got a history of science module, we've got the statistics. In the last term of the senior year, people do a senior project where they pick a topic and an advisor and do an extended paper on it, or a research project. So that's what you do over 4 years. You work your butt off, is what you do.
Sounds wonderful. I'd actually want to go there if I wasn't already an astrologer.
And actually a number of our people already are astrologers, because that's the point. Kepler is not designed to teach people to become professional astrologers. It's really to encourage people to view astrology as well as their whole lives from a different perspective, which is, yes, there's an astrological perspective there, but it's also a perspective of how to question things, how to look at knowledge, how to look at statements, and how to correlate them. So it's a much broader process than just the astrological, but it kind of tends to put everything on its head.
Yeah. I've been reading The Moment of Astrology by Jeffrey Cornelius, and for research for the documentary mainly, and for my own interest. I've always wanted to read this, and I like what he's talking about with like Pico and all these like people in the Italian Renaissance who became religious and started shooting astrology down, you know. And can you say something about the church's persecution of astrology and how, you know, we sort of got pushed to the sideline a little bit?
Well, you know, there's some questions there as to who pushed whom. Obviously, you know, during the Arabic period, within, in a sense, Islam may be as difficult in a sense as Christianity when it comes to astrology. Not when during the Middle Ages, but certainly now. Because what developed out of certain portions of Islam is Allah is so powerful within their cosmology that Allah literally, in some forms of Islam, Allah is creating the moment, or every instant is a recreation, if you will. Now, how you get long periods of time to work in that kind of a context is a really interesting idea. But within Christianity, I think the basic issue is that Christianity took a number of centuries to sort out as to what it was. And there's, you know, more and more and more historical research on this, because basically at the time that Jesus died, none of his disciples actually had the slightest clue what that meant. And, I mean, they knew they were followers of him. They knew what, you know, pieces of what he said. But the concept of Son of God is not a concept which is directly derivable from Proto-Mark and the earliest gospel sources. It took the Christian church a number of centuries to come up with what we now just take for granted as Christian belief. But the thing is that as Christianity was developing into the religion it is today, one of the primary, you know, core issues of Christianity became the concept of salvation. And the whole issue that the Christ, as understood in Christianity, was there, whoever believes in me. So within this idea of salvation, this idea of salvation through belief or through works, I mean, there are various ideas with this. Christians always, from that point on, were enjoined, required to make a choice. At some point, you had to sign on to the program. Okay, which required that, you know, required an effort. I mean, most Christian sects do infant baptism. Okay, now, when you're having that oil and that water thrown at you when you're a few days old, there is no free will. Okay? But later on, when you're reciting a credo, you're supposed to be honestly and in your heart, you know, signing on to the plan. Well, so here's the thing. If astrology is true, and if, as an astrologer, I make the statement that religious belief is shown by the 9th house, and possibly secondarily by the 3rd house, and by the condition of Jupiter, and that if the ruler of the 9th house is afflicted, that the person will tend toward atheism or apostasy or non-belief. And now, I have that configuration, and you have the good Jupiter that makes you, you know, into a good believer. Well, what does this mean if both of us are supposed to sign on to the program? Because you are going to tend to sign on to the program because you've got this chart that's consonant with that idea. I'm going to not sign on to the program because my chart says now apostasy and so forth. Well, now, is this fair? Have we both got the same chance for salvation? This is a huge conundrum within a Christian context. Now, notice that one was not a conundrum within Judaism, because Judaism never based its self-definition on acceptance of the belief in God. You were a Jew because your mother was a Jew, or at some point because your parent was a Jew. You know, so that was a biology thing. And so it wasn't, it's not like you had to sign on to the belief. I mean, the Shema is there as a statement of belief, but it's not that separated you. So again, with the Christian church, what developed out of this was just as I was mentioning before about skepticism, that when your approach is because you're an atheist and you don't really believe in higher order stuff, therefore you have to see astrology as being bogus because you can't see how it can work without this higher order stuff. That in the same sense, what developed was this idea within the Christian hierarchy that everybody had to have equal access to salvation. And so if the birth chart is not showing equal access to salvation, then something's wrong. And so what kind of developed in the Middle Ages as the compromised positions in this stuff is, astrology can affect the body. So you can use astrology for medical astrology, because that has no impact on salvation. Astrology can impact the weather, because again, that's simply a sign, if you will, that God is saying that, okay, we're going to have stormy nights. It's not affecting salvation. Where they drew the line was any form of astrology which could impact free will. And so that meant that kind of this general medical use of astrology was cool, but talking about things like the religious profession of the native, which is actually a category of delineation that's in Lily's book, for example, and in many of the other books that, no. And Hori astrology and intellectual astrology were banned in much the same way because this was having impacts on these areas of free will. So the issue was free will. The issue was not astrology. Now, where you get into some questions with Pico, Pico's a big topic because there were actually two Picos. There was Pico Senior and Pico Nephew. And Pico Nephew appears to have been probably the less humorous of the two, and probably involved with more of the damage, so to speak. But it's also true that astrology didn't fall apart right after Pico's work was published either, so how much of an impact that really had is anybody's guess. Where it does seem to fall apart, again this is Patrick Curry's work, is that in the 17th century, the middle of the 17th century is marked by the English Civil War, which was the time when Charles I came up against Parliament and ultimately lost his head in the process. Well, during that time period, you had censorship by the crown went away as the crown became less powerful. And a whole lot of polemic was going on by astrologers about what was going on. So William Lilly was publishing all these things saying that, that the Parliament is going to win, and George Wharton was saying, well, no, the King's going to win, and this was all really, really fun stuff to read. And so these became the bestsellers in the period of time. When you got the Restoration later on, after the Stuart line, what basically happened is that the people in power realized, geez, astrology is a really good tool for polemics, and it's very, and it had this big impact politically. We don't want this. This is dangerous stuff. And so what you find at the end of the 17th century is astrology becoming laughable, not because anybody disproved it, but basically because the trendsetters, who were the people at the top of the heap, didn't really want it to be around anymore. So funny, it stopped being around anymore.
Like the people coming out of the Enlightenment.
Yeah, exactly. And then with the development of the Enlightenment, that became a different issue.
Wow. As an astrologer, how do you prepare for a session, and what advice could you give to, say, a new astrologer who gets nervous before the client comes? Because there's so much to think about and do and get ready for. When you've been doing it for years, it's easy because you're just flowing, but to the new astrologer who's nervous, like, oh no, what am I going to say? How do you deal with that nervousness, and how do you prepare for a session?
Well, I think you answered it. Ultimately, the nervousness is cured by time. Let's be honest. I think in general, as a rule for anybody starting out in a craft, it's better to do a few things well than a lot of stuff poorly. So the first thing that I would recommend to anybody is, instead of trying to do every possible technique you've ever heard about, learn a few techniques well, and then later on add on to things when you're really totally confident with what you're doing. So that's the first thing I would recommend. The second thing that I would just say, and maybe I'm speaking to this as a point of belief, but it is my sense that the clients that walk in your door are there for several reasons. Sometimes they're there to teach you a lesson, which is not always totally comfortable, but oh well. But a lot of the times, they're there because they're who you can help. And if you can just, whether that's true or not, if you can operate out of that belief, it's a lovely belief. Because it gives you a level of confidence in what you're doing that you might not otherwise have. One of the things a lot of astrologers comment on is how when, somebody's having a particular transit, then 6 people show up at their door having the same transit. So, I mean, there's that kind of a phenomenon that there seems to be a kind of a cluster effect of how clients show up. So, I mean, the answer is you do the best you can, but don't scatter yourself too badly, because you'll just end up confusing yourself, and then you can't really help the client.
Even Edgar Casey's guides told him only do 2 readings a day for maximum health.
Well, I think there's this thing. I don't do a whole lot of natal astrology, and horary is much less susceptible to burnout. I think one of the problems that people have doing natal is that you think you've got to do the whole thing in one session. Well, wrong. You don't. For one thing, think about, can your client actually sit through 2 hours and still be and be anything but a vegetable at the end of it? I mean, yeah, a lot of people tape, and that helps. But so one of the things I would immediately say to a new astrologer is, don't plan on a session that's too long. Probably plan on your sessions not lasting more than an hour to an hour and 15 at the most. And so that's one thing that'll, again, keep it down to a manageable chunk. Don't assume you have to do everything. And ask questions. I mean, that's one thing. Ask the client what they're there for, what they want, so that you make sure that you can address the client's issues as clearly as you can, and not make assumptions about what they should be. Because one of the other things that you discover as people show up is that a lot of what people are looking for isn't so much dependent on their transits as their age. And the kind of stuff that somebody at 20 or 25 or 30 might be interested in is radically different than somebody at 40 or 50 or 60. So, again, those are some of the things you have to learn.
Oh, yeah. I've already taken your advice. I have the cosmic therapy package where someone signs up for 4 readings, an hour. They come once a week. We start off with natal, and then we do transits, progressions, then we do karmic, soul, look at the deeper implications.
Yeah, you can't do it all at once. I mean, you're burned out, they're burned out, and after a certain amount of time, it's like trying to lecture to people without taking breaks. After a while, everybody just glazes, and who's getting anything out of that?
Yeah. Could you talk to us quickly or longly, however about the astrological community? I mean, I've been to 3 conferences now this year. I mean, I've been to hundreds, not hundreds, but lots of conferences. And every time I go, I notice that astrologers aren't just astrologers. They're incredibly brilliant people that have other talents like arts or musicians or this, that, and the other. And here we are, we're gathering these conferences, and it's just an amazing experience. And what has your experience been with the whole friendships created over the years?
Well, I think one of the things is that really until Kepler, and there are a few places going on in the UK that are similar to Kepler at the master's level, until people were actually able to get academic degrees in astrology, you had to get your degree in something else. So right away there, I mean, it's not like American society had wanted any of us to grow up to be astrologers. I mean, did any of us at the age of 6 or 7 or 8 say, what do you want to be when you grow up? Oh yeah, I want to be an astrologer. You didn't even know that was an option. So, I mean, bottom line, that meant you trained in other things. So, I think that's one thing, is that almost by definition we all develop skills in other areas, and that, and I would certainly say that as a result of that, there's a richness there. That may not be true when it's too easy to track into it at an early age. I think overall that's good, because I think since most of us do end up doing consulting work to a greater or lesser extent, you know, if you're going to talk to people, you have to have some concept of what they are and what they're going through and what the rules are of the game that they're playing. And you're not going to learn those pieces of life if you're not out there living. So, so having this kind of broad background, I think, is a good thing. I guess my perspective on the astrological community is a kind of a more a through time one, of looking at the community over the past 20 or 30 years or so. There have been a lot of changes in the community that have been more than just the personnel changes of people leaving and people coming in and so forth. Ideas have floated through it. I think that when I think back to the astrological community of the 70s or 80s, there was, I think that, strangely enough, I think there was less tolerance then. Because I think that a lot of people would get into whatever it was that they were doing, and that was going to, you know, and that was basically the only right way. And I remember conferences, say 25 years ago, where it was not uncommon, let's have a debate on house systems. You know, well, that was a really exciting experience. Well, yeah, okay. Let's have a way of being able to say nasty things to each other in the guise of talking about a subject. So I think a lot of that has gone away. When classical astrology started coming up in the 80s, there was a lot of hostility to it. I was actually, I think, one of the few people who was consistently saying through that period of time, this isn't about either or, let's get over it, because this isn't about. And so I guess my attitude has always been not, let's, you know, build up one camp at the expense of the other. But I think it is important that we understand what we're doing, what the basis of what we're doing, what the history of what we're doing is. Because the one thing where I do fly off the handle, and of course justifiably because I'm doing it, is when people make statements where they don't really know their historical basis. And so it ends up with a lot of really strange things being said because people make assumptions. Good thing on that. How have astrologers developed their ideas for a new body? Now there's a good one. What did astrologers do when Uranus was discovered? What did astrologers do when Neptune was discovered? Well, there's been all sorts of horse manure out there over the past 20 or 30 years about how the rulerships of the outer planets developed. And the thing is, people weren't even bothering to look. And that's what I object to. If you have a discussion about what the rules should have been or what the logic should have been, where everybody understands what the actual history was, and you try to understand as best you can what actually happened, one thing, fine. Have the free-for-all, it's fun. It's even more fun in the bar with a few drinks. But when people are simply making statements because they assume that's how it should have been, that's just sloppy. So I think there's a little less sloppiness now in the community, and I think also the increased interest in Vedic astrology in this country has been good, because I think having different cultural perspectives ultimately will always broaden people's point of view. It gives you something to bounce off against. And, you know, I think one of the worst things for any of us is to get too parochial. I think about the fact that in the 1930s, if you look at what was going on sociologically here in the United States and in Britain, you had two societies between the wars. You know, they of course didn't know they were between the wars. As far as they were concerned, the war to end all wars had already happened. Okay, so here you have a woman by the name of Rose Starr Campbell, who was in the United States writing for some of the pulp astrology magazines at the time, talking about Uranus and Taurus, and talking about actually some of the asteroids in Taurus, and using this as a prediction for a brand new era of world peace. Now, she was making this prediction about the period where Hitler and the Nazis took over the Reichstag, and that you could very, in retrospect, see as being the genesis of World War II. Now, was she a bad astrologer, a laughable astrologer? Should we all be going, I'm glad she wasn't in my group? No, she was an astrologer who was very much a product of her time. And what she said in that political prediction is what she desperately wanted to be true. And that's the thing, and this is one of the things we always have to fight against as astrologers. It's like, when you're showing this next year in 2008, we're going to be in the middle of a presidential election. Everybody's going to be talking about who's going to be winning the American presidency. Me. And if it follows what I have seen happen with every single presidential election since I've been in astrology, is that probably better than 80% of the presidential predictions will be exactly who that individual astrologer is voting for. Now, for most of us, who we're voting for is not actually a good predictive tool, because we're all passionate citizens as well as being astrologers. So the thing is, but you need to recognize the difference between what you want and what you're seeing. And this is the perfect case, and this is where I get into my real point about Kepler and about critical thinking, which is what it is you're teaching in a bachelor's program, is that you need to be able to see that difference. You need to be able to at least attempt to find a way to ground your prediction of something political, say, whether it's the peace in our lifetime or whether it's who's going to win the next election. You need to find a way to ground that where it's not just based on the fact that you can't possibly accept the idea that a Republican can win in 2008. Well, that's not enough, because you were probably saying the same thing in 2004 and possibly in 2000. And so what has that proved other than that you were wrong? So these are the kinds of things that we all need to work on as a community. And we really have to chide ourselves when we get into a little too much of our own wishful thinking on it, because it's embarrassing.
Happened to me once on a Super Bowl prediction. And after I looked back at the symbols after I was like, it's obvious that the other team was going to win.
In those areas, I've been working with quantitative models for well over a decade, because precisely the same thing. I mean, I don't trust myself. I mean, I'm too pet. If it's the Super Bowl and it's two teams I could care less about, that's way easier than if it's my team. And when have any of us been looking at political elections in for the last few decades where we didn't have a point of view? I'm sorry.
Yeah. Books that you've written, could you talk about those and what inspires you to work? And are you writing anything and working anything now?
Well, the first book I wrote was the Ultimate Asteroid book, which I had been doing some work on asteroids for a number of years. And I didn't actually have the name for it. My publisher named it. And I remember thinking, if I accept this name of the Ultimate Asteroid book, I was like, when you publish that, what's left? It's like ultimate is kind of the end point, which was very funny, but that's how the universe works, because basically as soon as I published it, I was out of the field. When I got done with the asteroid book, I said, okay, I'm tired of doing lectures that are all entitled Asteroids in the Blank. And so what am I going to work on? And my partner, Maggie Meister, said, well, let's look around at some things that nobody else is working on. And I hit upon essential dignities. And at first I was working in the modern sense of looking at dispositor rings and things like that. Got into the old material. And that's when the classic bug hit me in the 80s, and so that was my next book. The book after that was the Book of Rulerships, and that was basically, it's a reference guide. It gives a lot of rulerships, classical ones, of course, but what I did, which was different, is I actually gave citations as to who said it, and that allowed me also to deal with where people had different points of view, so you can follow the author that you want. After I did that, I wrote Classical Astrology for Modern Living, which was a book to show people how to integrate some classical techniques into a modern reading. I wasn't taking the point of view that I did or wanted to just do a classical style reading. That, of course, is quite possible, but that may not be the best thing. At that point, I took a little break, and I accepted a commission from Donald Weiser to translate Pappas's book Astrology for Initiates from the French. Pappas, many of you might know from the Tarot of the Bohemians. He was a 19th century occultist in France. Was known primarily for his tarot work, but actually he was very much an astrologer, very good at it. And he wrote a book on astrology which was not published in his lifetime. So I did a translation and a critical commentary on it. And then I finally got to the martial art of Hori astrology, which was like the thing I've been working on all the way along, kind of in the background. And what I've been working on now is mainly Kepler, because since Kepler opened, I've not had a whole lot of free time to do my own stuff. But in the background and slowly, I'm working on a book on, which will probably be called The Martial Art of Medical Astrology, because that's kind of my next step.
Which is kind of interesting. The martial art. Wow.
Yeah. Well, it's a few years of Taekwondo, but I actually think that the way that when you're doing predictive astrology is like martial arts. It really is. There's a Mars component to it, because you've got to lay it out there. And the other thing is you can be wrong. And this is like, you can get creamed. So in that sense, it's very much like martial arts. You're putting it out there, and you're right or you're wrong.
I studied martial arts with my sensei from Japan, and whew,
yeah,
you better learn how to block.
That's right. Blocking is a good thing.
His style was very karate mixed with kung fu, judo, and ninjutsu, and he developed the underwater fighting techniques for the Navy SEALs. It was cool having a sensei like that, and an astrology teacher.
Yeah.
Crossed out, I had an astrology teacher, sensei, and a great writing teacher. Spiritual path. A lot of astrologers believe in a transcendent being or an infinite intelligence, what most religions would call God, Allah, the eternal source, the creator. Do you have any approach to faith, or has astrology increased your faith or your sort of belief that there's a sort of, divine order?
Astrology has neither increased nor decreased it. Where I would see my path as having been in that area is not so much through astrology, although astrology can illustrate it, which is a different point. But where I have been interested in this has basically been through my involvement in feminism over the decades, that having to come to grips with what are the intrinsic pieces of religion and what are the pieces that are societally imposed, which is to say the sexist or the racist or the other culturally based components. That's really been the area that I've grappled with personally over the years. And so, certainly there's been a history in astrology of using astrology as a spiritual tool. But in my own case, I've seen that as descriptive, not as as something to increase or decrease.
The ancient, since the movie's going to be called Return of the Magi, or as they pronounce it in British, Magi. It's almost like they choke when they say it. What is a Magi, or a Magus for that matter?
Well, again, it depends on your point of view. Originally, it was simply a Chaldean, which was to say that in societies like Greece, where a Chaldean was, the Chaldeans were seen as an older, more cultured type at one point who had this thing called divination in their practice. So, was it an astrologer, strictly speaking? No. But I think that the concept of Magi basically involved those who paid attention to omens. Now, it's interesting about these omens because, you talk about the porousness between the Greek period and the Vedic period, but the fact is it's far broader than that, because the Babylonian material makes it over into Asia as well. And it's thought that some of the Chinese interest in what becomes the 60 cycle, which is the 5 elements with the 12 signs, as we would say it now, but the 60-day cycle, the whole interest in 60, the moment you see the word 60, think Babylonian, it's the base 60 system. And the Babylonian material made it over. There's some evidence that the Buddha himself was acquainted with some of the Babylonian omen texts, because there were Babylonian omen texts that made it into India and to China. So there, it's a broader thing. So as far as Magi, it's paying attention to the signs, and that's it. I think, as I said, when my own approach to horror astrology is not being limited to having to do it through a chart. I mean, I've made comments over the years about whether you're doing the I Ching or Tarot or astrology. It's like the technology for reading is what changes, but the essence is still there. That there is a kind of questioning that people ask. Where you're up against a very stark choice in your life, and it's like this is the moment where you need some help. And whether whatever your technology is for doing that, it's a fundamental piece of the puzzle that goes beyond whether you're doing it through trines, or whether you're doing it with essential dignities, or you're doing it in the sidereal zodiac. So it's not so much about the techniques as about the process. And I think within that greater context, that's where astrology speaks to spirit. It's not so much the technique as in recognizing the richness of moments and of omens, and of the fact that a point where you come to a crossroads is a significant moment. Just the acknowledgement of that, and looking for the signs, whether the signs are astrological or the signs are in a different context, but looking for signs.
And I guess the modern person, to differentiate a sign like from a stop sign, I guess would even understand it more if you said symbol.
Yeah, and maybe the best thing to do is go out and look at the shape of the clouds, but that's a sign too.
Let them be for signs.
Mm-hmm.
Is there anything I should ask you that I don't know to ask you?
Just don't ask me the meaning of life, or I'll say 42, right? I haven't a clue, Kelly.
Anything you'd like to say to the aspiring new astrologer coming in the field, just got beyond sun signs, got their chart on the internet, and they're like, wow, now there's sites where you can understand, get readings without an astrologer, just learn stuff on the internet.
Mm-hmm. I'm assuming that's your cell phone.
Oh. There.
Okay, good.
Let me turn down silence.
Yeah.
That's my favorite Sagittarian, happy.
Yeah.
Riding my horse.
Yeah, as long as it's not the Ride of the Valkyries.
Right?
Yeah. I think the thing is that it's a journey, it's a path, it's something that you can follow for your life. And, I don't think astrology has the answers, to a large extent, because it doesn't limit you. Because if it really had the answers, it would be limited. That's one of the points. It's more about giving you clues. And also, one of the best things astrology does for you over time is it tells you when the nastier pieces are going to be over with. Now, sometimes you don't like the answer to that, but at least you also get this idea that nothing that's in your life right now necessarily is forever. So it's about reminding you of the process of life, and that an intrinsic part of our life is change, and astrology is simply a way of, if you will, of analyzing the change, of seeing the change, of trying to verbalize the change. And so from that standpoint, it's a powerful tool. On the other hand, you still got to go out and live your life.
Yeah, I like to journal my transits, Like, Jupiter's here in this sign, in this house, making this aspect, and like a poet, come up with all these different things, and then try to experience them or work them. And I think with clients, they come and they're in the middle of the dark night or whatever, the soul and whatever is going on in their chart. It just gives them incredible confirmation.
Yeah. Oh, yeah. And confirmation is a huge piece of what astrology is doing. The other thing is, you think about astrology as a life process. There are going to be points where you're more connected. There are going to be points where you're less connected. There are going to be points where you're slightly or majorly inclined to throw all your books out, and probably is a bad idea. But because astrology itself in the life tends to ebb and flow too, as so much else does. It is, it's if it's going to be a sign of your life, it's got to have its ups and downs too. But it's a journey.